Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. Today being the 6th of February, it is time that we solemnly remember the last King of Ireland and indeed the last Emperor of India, George VI. Now, I know really his name was Albert Frederick Arthur George Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, but he was not known by that. So he's got four names, forename as in Forename. One of my forenames is George, that's my Christian name, and I have a middle name as well. But members of royal families tend to have several forenames, four as in forward or before names, and they pick one of those as a regnal name. In his case, he chose George, the last of those forenames, and of course the surname, as I said, was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, because he was descended from Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. But in 1917, the British royal family, they changed their surname to Windsor after their famous castle, because all things Germanic were detested during the Teutonophobia of the First World War. So King George VI, he was born in Sandringham. That's the royal family's private estate in Norfolk, and indeed he died in Sandringham as well, some 56 years later, 56 and a half. So his father later became George V, and his mother was May of Teck. Well, she was Queen Mary later on. She came from one of the German states. Remember, Germany only became a united country in 1871, and there was obviously the Kingdom of Prussia, and the King of Prussia became German Emperor as well, several kingdoms, grand duchies and so on, and his mother had come from one of those grand ducal states. So he grew up partly in Sandringham, partly in London, things like that. And he never went to school. Royalty did not go to school in those days. They had private tutors. And he had a brother, who, like the future King Edward VIII, who was just a year older than him. His brother was known as David within the family. And Edward VIII, oh my goodness, I can't remember his names in exact order, but they'd be like Andrew, Patrick, David, George, and I can't remember the other one, but as in the patron saints of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. They're not in that order. So George VI, as I say, known as Bertie within the family because of Albert, the first of his forenames. So he wasn't an academic sort of person, and he had a speech impediment because he was left-handed in those days. Oh, no, that's completely unacceptable. Well into the 1950s, I knew left-handed children being forced to use their right hand. Remember, left-handed was being sinister in every sense. So we now recognise that's obviously horrific and anti-pedagogical. So, and he had a sort of knock knees and had to wear some uncomfortable apparatus to correct that. And then he went to Osborne on the Isle of Wight, and he later entered a Royal Naval Academy as a boy at age about 12, and they were given no special consideration owing to their princely status. So they were driven hard. It was severely disciplined. So that's the thing is, some wealthy parents really spoiled their children, and certainly the British royal family did not. They were firm with them, and you must be brought up to leadership, and there are strict standards. And that's the thing of the Royal Navy, is they would, in some sort of official circumstances, be honoured for their exalted status as a royal personage, but otherwise that was their honorary rank, then they had their substantive rank, and they could be dressed down and given a tongue lashing like any other naval cadet or naval officer. So that was that. So he was a little boy in 1901, that January, when his grandmother, Queen Victoria, died. Sorry, what am I talking about? His great-grandmother, Edward VII, his grandfather became king, he died in 1910. Then his father, George V, became king in 1910. So what else? He was in the Royal Navy before the First World War. He was known as Mr. Johnson's code name. He was in the First World War fighting there. He was at the Battle of Jutland. Because they didn't want the enemy to know where he was, because they might make a special effort to sink that ship. It's a bit like his older brother, Edward VIII, was the Prince of Wales at the time. When he was at the front with the Welsh Guards, in the Western Front, Lord Kitchener, the British commander, said, "I don't mind your being killed, but I do object to your being captured, because if you're taken prisoner, you might be tortured into signing some false statement, some surrender document or whatever." They couldn't broadcast over the radio in those days, posing for propaganda photos, so it would have a most cataclysmic effect on morale. Anyway, so right after the First World War, George VI, he went to Trinity College, Cambridge. He spent a year there. So this was a new thing. Well, not that new thing. Edward VII would be the first to go to university, just spending a year or two, gaining a bit of polish and not graduating, leaving without any intention of graduating. And into the 20th century, that wasn't that unusual and wasn't considered a disgrace. These days, if you leave early without a degree, that's dropping out as a failure. Not so back then. So he carried on in the Royal Navy. He was fixated with a married Australian lady, a woman of considerable means, but he was persuaded by his father to drop it with her, stop this extramarital affair. And then he was introduced to Lady Bowes-Lyon, the scion of a Scottish noble house. So they got married in 1923, and in 1926 their first child, Elizabeth II, was born, as in the current Queen, born on Bruton Street in London in a house which no longer exists. So George VI, he was Duke of York at the time. The second son of the monarch usually gets the title Duke of York. He had other titles like Lord Killarney, as in Killarney in Ireland. But that was that. There was a conflict going on in Ireland at the time, but obviously George V had been to Dublin in 1911, shortly after his coronation. It was very well received in Ireland. Then 1921, that July, George V went to Belfast to open the Parliament of Northern Ireland, telling Irishmen to stretch out the hand of forbearance to absolve each other. And that was that. So we know on the 6th of December 1921 a treaty was signed in London with the Sinn Féin delegation with the government of the United Kingdom. And the major portion of Ireland, that's 26 counties, left the United Kingdom and formed the Irish Free State. Northern Ireland could join that, or the Parliament of Northern Ireland could address His Majesty saying they wished to remain in the United Kingdom, which indeed they did, so that was that. So a new title was created, King of Ireland. Well, not completely new, sorry, we revived the title that used to exist until New Year's Day 1801. So George V became King of Ireland, as well as being King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, confusingly, because you would have thought King of Ireland, well, Ireland refers to the whole of Ireland, including Northern Ireland, but there we are. So in order to get into the Parliament of Southern Ireland, as it then was, it's now the Oireachtas, people had to take an oath of allegiance, saying, I'll be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King George V, blah, blah, blah. So that was that, and all these Sinn Féiners were doing that. Well, not all of them, but most of them. But they called themselves Cumann Gael, that's now Fine Gael, the Labour Party, and blah, blah, blah. And eventually Fianna Fáil was created by Sinn Féiners who are willing to do this whilst holding their nose, not literally, take the oath. That's Eamon de Valera, led his party into the Oireachtas, that's the Parliament of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland as it now is, and eventually, obviously, de Valera got rid of these oaths. And the monarchy became more or less invisible in the south of Ireland. And we know we had a republic founded on Easter Monday, 1949. Well, George VI, anyway, he acceded in December 1936 because his brother, Edward VIII, stood aside over his unfortunate liaison with Mrs. Simpson. He wasn't willing to keep her as a mistress, insisted on marrying her despite having been twice divorced, almost 40, having no children, presumably infertile. She had no children with him. And on and on. Also, the reason why she might have been unsuitable may well have been a Nazi sympathiser, a conduit for state secrets being passed to Joachim Ribbentrop, the German ambassador, later the foreign minister, and on and on. So George VI, who's a very retiring figure, had greatness thrust upon him, as Shakespeare would say, became King of Ireland, Emperor of India, King of the United Kingdom, and all the rest of it. So he was a reluctant monarch, and was a very slender man, a very private person, only wished to be a naval officer, and was forced into the limelight, and he discharged his duties as best he could. And he went on a tour of the United States in 1939, just before the Second World War broke out. And there was a great strain on him during the war because he knew how grave the situation was. And that was that, but it all went right in the end in 1945. But as you may know, he had a very silly voice. If he was around today, he would have been mercilessly lampooned by the press. But back then, the British media was exceedingly deferential, would never publish anything disobliging about the royal family. There was no law of lèse-majesté. People could insult the royal family as much as they wanted to, but there was simply a convention among Fleet Street, that's the British newspapers, and the BBC, which is the only radio broadcast at the time, that they wouldn't say anything that reflected discredit on the House of Windsor. So that was that. 1949, the war was over. And obviously India became independent, and he assumed the title King of India rather than Emperor of India. And on the 26th of January 1950, India became a republic, so he no longer had that title pertaining to India. Obviously, the Commonwealth of Nations was gaining more and more members in Africa and Asia as former colonies became independent. It was called the British Commonwealth in those days, but in the 60s it became the Commonwealth of Nations. So he had a notably happy marriage to his wife, Elizabeth, and he had obviously his two daughters, Elizabeth, born in 1926, Margaret, born in 1930. She was born in Balmoral. They had no more children. And in the Second World War, he was in London most of the time, but they drove back to Windsor Castle. So Windsor was never bombed because Adolf Hitler planned that Windsor would be his personal residence when he conquered Great Britain. And Windsor Castle would be where he would live. So I'm not sure if the British authorities knew that, but if they did, it would be a good reason for him to stay at Windsor Castle. He was in failing health in the late 40s, and he delegated to his eldest daughter, his heir, Elizabeth, the Princess of Wales, as the current queen, and the monarch saved his strength for occasions where he felt the sovereign's presence was absolutely critical. And that was that. And he eventually got cancer of the lung. He was a heavy smoker, as almost everyone was. He began to lose feeling in one of his legs because there was poor circulation there. You can see when his daughter headed off on her tour of the Commonwealth in January 1952, he was looking very drawn and haggard as he said farewell to her at the airport when she went off with her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. That's Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. And of course, it's the last time they ever saw each other because he died in his sleep at Sandringham in 1952. Well, that's 6th of December. He'd been out duck hunting the day before, despite it being damp and chilly. Was that deliberate? You see the series The Crown, they make it seem like he almost had a death wish. So he'd approved of her marriage to Prince Philip of Denmark and Greece. Remember, when Greece became independent, they decided to have a monarchy. They had a Bavarian king for a while, didn't work out. They got a junior prince from Denmark, and that founded the Greek royal family. That was Prince Philip. Won't tell you too much about him. But so George VI, there he died. He obviously had a state funeral, and he's interred at St George's Chapel, Windsor. That is a monarch who did his duty manfully. You should see that film, The King's Speech, which is fairly accurate. How he loathed speaking in public, and he was a tongue-tied sort of a person. But it was his duty, and he bore it as best he could to address people, because he had a voice which was risible and often stammered and things like that. So this is the trouble about monarchy, is the luck of the draw. The current queen is fantastic, but her father in some ways was not suitable for this role because he loathed speaking in public, but he did what he needed to, wanted to be seen and not heard, and speak as little as possible. There we are. That is George VI, a dutiful monarch.